On episode 2 of Tower Prep, we delve into the murky world of in-game economics. Inflation, stagnation, devaluation, all of these things can plague us in real life, but will also play out in many of our favorite games. The rules, however, are usually very different and can often pit veterans versus new players, whales versus free-to-play, and often leave a development team caught in the middle. What are some of the biggest economic issues in the tower? How might we fix them? And what are the consequences to not addressing them at all? We're also going to take a look at some more of your best and worst suggestions and explore a timeline where mass replaces speed as our biggest nemesis. The study of economics is probably one of the oldest social sciences that humanity has. Understanding the relationship between cost of goods and price points is integral to the success of civilization. In its most simplest form, we tend to think of economies as being a function of supply and demand. The idea is that to achieve the appropriate balance and price points on goods and services, the supply for those goods and services has to equal out to the demand. When those two balance, we kind of achieve this magical invisible hand that sort of stabilizes economic interactions. When we talk about in-game economies, we're still dealing with supply and demand, but they can look a little bit different. When we're talking about games, the currency is hard-coded in, as well as the removal of currency. So we tend to talk about in terms of source and sink. Sources are the sources for those currencies, whatever those economic currencies might be for the game. How do we as players achieve those currencies? In what way can we bring them into our game? Sinks are ways in which those currencies leave the game. And it's important to realize that source and sink is literally the incoming of the currency into the game world, and sinks are the removal of that currency from the game world. This differs from what we could talk about in player-to-player economic transactions, where there's trade, where currency that's entered the world is exchanged with other characters. That currency is not created at the moment of that trade, nor does it leave the economy. When sources and sinks are in proper balance, the value of the currency can be set to what the developer wants it to be. When either the source or the sinks become unbalanced, we can have a situation where those currencies' actual inherent value can become chaotic. In player-to-player transactions, that's where we see things like inflation, where the cost of things goes up exponentially. You can imagine a situation where if we were allowed to trade in the tower, established players that can farm 1 trillion coins in a day could then offer to buy, a new player's gems that they're farming for those coins. And that tends to create chaos in the markets because it produces a strange leveling curve for new players, as well as changing the market for gems or stones or whatever currency is being exchanged that differs fundamentally from the vision of the developers. However, in the tower, we don't have these player-to-player interactions, so really we only have to worry about the source and sink within our respective games. We all sort of have the same sources as well as the same sinks. Now, we don't have access to the same sources and sinks at all stages of the game, which causes currency's value to change both as a function of changes in the overall game, as the developer changes the code in the game, changes the economy of the game. The relative sources and sinks change in their value, but also our experience in the game and what we are able to achieve as our individual players and what we need to get also change the value of those currencies. So when we talk about changes in the economy, we have to think both in terms of changes that are occurring because of fundamental changes to the game and changes that are merely a function of your advancement into the game, accessing both new sources of currency as well as new sinks for currency. We have a handful of currencies in the game. We have coins, cash, stones, gems, and the new medals or badges from the events. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about cash. Cash has increased value in the early game and becomes nearly a useless commodity in the in game. But because it's only centered within the advancement of your tower within a single run or a single round, I don't think there's a whole lot of value in us thinking too hard about cash. There's certainly been some interesting history to cash, like the times when interest was not capped. So there was not a max interest, and the generation of cash income that could be produced in those early versions of the games was comical, but again, I don't think has a whole lot of utility in our discussion of understanding the economics of the tower. So instead, I want to focus on coins, gems, stones, and to some extent, metals. One of the currencies that sees the most dramatic shift in value across the game is coins. Now, this is both a function of changes to the core code and development, as well as changes to access to sources for coins within the game. New players may struggle to achieve 1,000 or 1,000,000 coins in a run, while in-game players are achieving 250 to 300 billion coins in that same run. New players may struggle to earn 1,000,000 coins in a day, whereas in-game players are generating 1 trillion coins in a day. This massive expansion of the amount of source that we have leads to a problem of sync. If you want coins to feel meaningful to in-game players, you have to provide appropriate sinks for those coins. But if you create sinks for those coins that add substantial power to the tower, it can produce a really negative feeling to those sort of early to mid-game players that can't achieve those coin levels. We saw an early sort of exploration of this when Energy Shield was first introduced into the game. That third shield had a 900 billion coin price point. This was a point in the game where 1 trillion coins was a lot. To keep this in mind, right, that it took me about a year to earn my first trillion coins. 1 year to earn my first trillion coins. Now I can generate that in a single day. So the third energy shield arrived kind of in a transitionary period where we were beginning to earn substantially more points, but it was not nearly as many coins as we can generate today. And that 900 billion price point was a substantial amount of farming, even for established in-game players, and a near insurmountable amount for your new players. And there's a lot of friction that arose about that, especially because some players for a much cheaper price. But inherently, that third energy shield was a big coin sink and provided a lot of in-game utility. And that creates issues for those who are able to generate those coins, get that currency, to those who look at that and go, look, I'm earning 10,000 coins a run, and here's this $1 trillion price point. Seeing how you get to that point can be very difficult and can create that sort of negative psychological experience in playing the game. So we're seeing this friction beginning to develop between our established in-game players and our new game players. Now, there's ways you can rectify this. You can hide those coin sinks from those players, which is done to some extent by only making certain upgrades available as you advance in tiers and therefore have access to more source. That becomes more difficult when there's, a lot of online community, the Discord or the Reddit posting about all of these really cool things and their price points. You can also create a situation where there are coin sinks that don't provide such overwhelming advantage that it creates this sense of loss or FOMO in newer or mid-game players. This is kind of the approach that the development team has taken with the new workshop maxes. No one is maxing workshop with coins at the moment. The cost of damage and super crit are extensive, and no one is maxing those out. But because of the way the game works, with our ability to max those out very easily with cash, it doesn't matter. Yes, I can drop 30, 35 trillion coins into my workshop. That's a sink to an extent, right? The sink doesn't remove, because of respec and ability to pull those coins out, that changes the economics a little bit. But if we think about, at least for now, the coins in workshop as a sink, really the only true sink is in lab costs, because then those coins are removed. But we can think of it as a place to put our coins for value. The issue is that while we have a place to put our coins in, there's no return on those coins. So there's 0% practical value to our gameplay experience for that coin sink. So that means there's not much FOMO, there's not much, bad feelings about players that can't produce that kind of economy because of the, in-game advantage, because there is none, right? But then that completely devalues the currency of coins to those in-game players. Right? And this is sort of this point where we reach the struggle of this imbalance between source and sink. And while a lot of this can be attributed to sort of the advancement from early to in-game, it really has been a function of changes in development. With the introduction of Golden Tower in October of 21, we really began to see a substantial increase in the role of these ultimate weapons in determining the flow of the economy. I got to the point where new players were literally erasing and restarting their games if they didn't roll GT as their first ultimate weapon choice. To try to balance this, they introduced coin aspects to almost every single UW, right? So we got them on Spotlight, we got them on DW, and we got them on Black Hole. So by adding massive coin generation to these other ultimate weapons, it kind of decreases the sting of a late GT pull. But once people have all of these at once moving in conjunction, it creates this crazy exponential increase in coin generation, which was, I think, sort of an attempt to make all of the ultimate weapons balanced around the sort of feeling that they were valuable, where economy was kind of the fuel that ran this, right? The idea the development team was trying to do was to make each of these ultimate weapons have this sort of economic generation to kind of decrease the focus on GT. And while I think it helps to some extent, it does create this runaway process of coin generation. So we've now reached a point where for in-game players, coin currency is literally meaningless, utterly and completely meaningless. And this is problematic because outside of tournaments and events, coin generation and farming is a key aspect to the gameplay. So these in-game players are literally playing the game without any kind of reward. Right? They're getting coins, but those coins don't have an inherent reward. And that's why I think there's been a lot of focus. Once players reach that point, we start competing with each other to generate, coins, both in terms of the number that we can generate in a single round and our overall earnings. There's Discord roles based on those things. And if nothing else, we have shown that we are willing to do some crazy things for those Discord roles. So it's really the community and sort of the competition within the community that still fuels the desire to play and pursue the game. But there is no in-game mechanism to make playing the game rewarding, which means that essentially there is no power increase. And this is that idea where so many in-game players have reached where it's really, really hard to have progression. What everybody is looking for is that sensation of progression, that sensation of advancement. And the generation of coins is one of the primary limiting factors in progression through most of your early and mid-game experience, and then just disappears in the in-game. So that creates this devaluation, not only of the currency, but of the experience of the game itself. And that sort of creates this negative psychological space. So how do we go about fixing the situation once we have sort of runaway devaluation of the currency? There's a few things you can do. Some of them are much more draconian. We can just do straight resets where you take everybody's coins across the board and just reset them to zero, and we all start, over at zero, new player and old player alike. I don't think anybody wants to see that, but that is, you just remove the currency from the game and then restructure the source and sink based on that removal. And while that is a solution, again, I think there's many players that would quit if that was implemented. You can also introduce bigger sinks, but the key for this to work is you have to have meaningful progression associated with it. Yes, you can produce mega high sinks. We have mega high sinks in place right now in the workshop, but there is no return on that investment. We're not gaining any progression with that. And so it just feels placeholder. It just continues to be worthless. You can also introduce other forms of coin spending rather than straight up pre-programmed exchanges. You can add gambling aspects where you can bet a certain amount of coins to get a return. Perhaps we could set up a situation where we can gamble with coins to get a return on more valuable currencies, which could be, established currencies like gems or stones, but it could also be things like boosts. You can spend these coins on time boosts for your labs, boosts within the game itself. Some of FUD's other games, like the Idle Planet Miner, has these in-game boosts that can be applied for the gem currency. Perhaps there's an exchange you can do with a boost currency with coins. But the idea is however it's implemented, the idea ultimately comes down to you need a sink. You need a bigger sink, and that sink should provide meaningful progression, right? Because if it doesn't provide meaningful progression, we're right back to the situation where the currency has no inherent value. So this is the balance point between source and sink. We have out of control source right now. We have really large sinks, but those sinks are not meaningful because they don't produce actual progression. So finding a way to make those coin currencies provide progression is what's going to make the in-game feel better. But again, if the progression is too powerful, you risk alienating mid-game players that might be in a situation where they're competing in that same space as in-game players, but don't have access to those boosts. So it is a difficult balance. Stones and gems provide a slightly different issue with changes in the economics because these currencies are directly purchasable by real-world currency. And we have to think about the term devaluation a little more carefully. Devaluation is specifically the relationship of one currency to another. So when the game first started, there's a specific relationship between the value of gems and real-world dollars. That's established by the developer. That is related to how many gems can be earned within the game and how many gems can be purchased for a set economic amount. If you change how many gems can be earned in the game, or you change the cost of those gems relative to real-world currency, you can create situations where you either increase or decrease the relative value. You can imagine if there's several people who spent thousands of dollars on gems, and then tomorrow FUDS comes out and says, okay, never mind, I'm going to now sell the 100 pack of gems was now going to be 300,000 gems. That's going to create a sudden devaluation of those gems, not only from that point forward, but also perceptually to those players who have already spent that money. Now, I don't think the developer is going to come out and do that, but you can also devalue those currencies by allowing more of them to be earned within the game. So when you look at things like tournaments, the introduction of the Champion League, you now have created a situation where more gems and more stones are being generated relative to the initial cost of those stones, which does create real-world devaluation. The stones are losing their relative value because there's now more ways to earn them. Same with gems. So this now creates a situation where we are not only perceiving of a change in value of a currency within the framework of a game like coins, but we're now linking it to real-world money. And people are going to often have a much stronger response to loss of that money. The idea is even though we've already paid that money for that currency, and that currency was worth that money at the time we purchased it, the fact that the currency is no longer worth that amount, right, we are going to perceive that as a loss. If we viewed the 750 stone pack for what are $60, $70 as being a fair value a year ago, we may now no longer see it as quite a fair value because of the availability of stones in game has increased. This is exacerbated, though, by the structure of the game. The relative perceived devaluation of stones is not just based on the source of the stones changing in the game, but the inherent return on those stones. There is a very early sort of exponential growth in the power that we get from those stones as we add more ultimate weapons and level those ultimate weapons that then levels off pretty quickly. New stones that we generate, either through tournaments or through purchases, progressively give us a much, much smaller sense of progression or return on those values. And that feels even worse. That exasperates that difference that causes people to sort of start thinking about that loss of value. And once more, we reach a point where we see that one of the fundamental issues that are causing problems for the players is a lack of a sense of progression to the game. If these new stones that we were receiving had a direct output that we were seeing way to increase the performance of our tower, both in our farm runs and our tournament runs, we would see continued value in those stones. And I think there'd be a lot less concern about the increase in the availability of these stones. There's still maybe some concern, and it certainly, if FUDs continue to increase the ways in which we can earn stones, you do reach a point where you begin to create a serious devaluation, but I don't think we're there. I think we're only there because of that lack of progression. If stones could still be translated into progression, I think most of us would be okay with where we're at. The problem is that even though we still can spend $70 and 750 stones, that $70 has zero increase in our relative strength. We are not advancing our tower in a meaningful way. And we keep coming again and again and again to this idea that in-game progression, a sensation of improvement, has to be a necessary thing, right? The game is essentially over without it. And there is that early mid-game player, and the majority of players are not at the end game. I get that. But I would still argue that the majority of the income earned by the game is probably those in-game players. And you have to create a situation where those in-game players still enjoy the game, one, to generate income for it, and two, in-game players are often one of the biggest sources of information for the community and some of the glue that holds that community together. They offer an image for what is possible to drive people towards advancement. They're often the ones that are dedicated and have an understanding enough of the game to generate the spreadsheets, to answer questions of the community and bind things together. You have to create a meaningful experience for those in-game players, or essentially you have created a game that is, you start, you reach the end, and then that's it. There's no in-game. There's nothing for us to do further. And that's going to create this sort of negative psychological space that's going to exacerbate things like the perceived devaluation of the stones. In many ways, I think if we don't increase the amount of stones any further coming into the economy, and we find ways to produce meaningful progression through those stones, I think a lot of this will balance out. But again, we keep coming back to that same theme of producing progression at all levels of the game. Gems are another interesting sort of example where there is actually an increase in the relative value for gems when most of the current players came in. The sort of wild card in gem value is Tapjoy. Tapjoy is an interesting source for gems. And FUDs has on at least 2 occasions actually changed the internal valuation between the gem currency and Tapjoy, decreasing the amount of gems that you can pull. It was double or triple on the double Tapjoy day what it is now. Like, you were able to pull 30,000 gems from a standard Olay offer back in the day. One of the raid mobile game offers through Tapjoy could generate 25 to 30,000 for just the basic shards. We have seen a substantial loss of value in our Tapjoys. You're bang for your buck that the double Tapjoy days are probably the majority source of gems into the economy. Your taps of 2 gems and 5 gems are not insignificant overall, but definitely not a major source. In-game purchasing, the relative value, $100 for 3,000 gems. Nowadays, you can turn that $100 into 6,000 gems or something through Tapjoy. But like I said, back in the day, you could turn that $100 into 30,000 gems. So the value of gems has actually increased a little bit for a lot of the players that have come in later, right? Those of us who were out there at the beginning of Tapjoy got a big boost in the number of gems we've had. And now we've seen a slow devaluation as more sources of gems come in. But I don't know, the role of Tapjoy is just such a wild card. It makes it difficult to parse exactly what's going on with gems. Players who are willing to play in the Tapjoy world, able to identify the biggest boom for your buck or your time on the Tapjoy offers, are going to see a much greater influx of gems. It's, those people who aren't involved in Tapjoy, don't even look at it, don't pay attention to it, are going to have a very different experience with the real world currency valuation of gems. Gems are also complicated in that really Their primary sink is lab time. Most of your players are going to fairly quickly max their lab slots, get all their cards. Yeah, there's a lot of gems that go into that, but that's going to happen, right? There's a finite number of gems necessary to achieve that. And really, the primary sink for gems is all about rushing labs. And any changes in the valuation of gems to lab time is going to create increases or decreases in the relative value of gems. So when we see changes like we had recently that sort of increased the value of gems against lab time rushes, right? In other words, it costs less gems now to rush our labs. We see a slight devaluation in the role of gems. I don't think it's overwhelming, and I'm not super concerned about it, especially as somebody that was around for the early Tapjoy days. The valuation of gems is very complicated. Like I said, it's a bit of a wild card. One of the final ways that you can handle deflation, inflation, devaluation, and other changes in the currencies of your in-game economies is the introduction of new currencies. You'll see this in many cases where new expansions or new patches will introduce new sources of things to buy, but with a brand new currency that has yet to be earned. This allows all the players to kind of start at the same point, and there's not an inherent advantage to long established players. And it can, add that sense of progression to everybody across the board. And we've seen that directly with the tower with the introduction of events. Event badges and medals can be used to purchase the bots and only are earned through the completion of achievements during the events. So if we move the sense of progression into this world with the badges, then, this lets you balance the fact that there's so many stones, gems, and coins in the economy that you can more tightly control the increase of progression through badges. It also creates new sinks with the cosmetics. This is somewhat problematic in the sense that those of us that have large amounts of the old currencies of stones, coins, and gems, if our only progression moves through badges, then we're still back to the point of okay, well, why are we playing the game? There's now no point in farming or tournaments if progression moves only through badges. But it does balance out these source and sinks, so it can be utilized to some degree. Within the tower itself, we run into the problem that so far none of the bots are overwhelming in terms of the changes that they provide to progression, with things like amp bot and stun bot and gold bot having marginal changes to gameplay, with I think things like amp bot getting a little more emphasis with glass cannon builds, and a really solid amp bot may be necessary. But there's a lot of fear about how this will play out with future changes of range. But at the end of the day, the bots don't introduce massive sort of progression to the end game. So, it's there, right? But it's not overwhelming. And it's probably a decent balance, right? I think if there were other source of progression in the game, right? If we could in the in-game continue to advance our towers through stones, gems, and coins, the badges for what they are nicely balanced. The problem now is that there isn't progression to be had through gems, stones, and coins, so a lot of us are looking to those event badges and those bots to provide that sense of progression, and it's a little frustrating in the sense that we're so limited in their ability to get a hold of that currency. But also the relative value of that advancement is limited. But it is a potential solution, is the introduction of new currencies. And it's not phasing out the old currencies, but changing the focus such that maybe those currencies are important early to mid-game, and then in-game, these badges and other currencies take over focus. If you could make it such that those badges can be earned in larger amounts by in-game players, it might balance out, but we would need to see some pretty substantial changes to the badge system, as well as what those badges can provide as far as player power, to see that as a solution to the economic issues. So we've created sort of a general description of the source and sink problem that we face, and looked at how the increases of sources of all currencies has changed across the development of Tower and produced this overall feeling of currency devaluation. This gets exacerbated when we can relate that devaluation to real world currency, and introduces a situation that produces a lot of sort of negativity building up in the in-game player community. We have seen the introduction of large sinks into the game, but these large sinks do not provide us any meaningful progression in the game. And we've talked about how I think one of the most powerful solutions to the negativity that has built up around the devaluation of these currencies is a focus on in-game progression. That there has to be some substantial development focus on allowing that incremental progression to continue into the in-game. There should be a relative difference between players that is much more minute and much more fine-grained than we currently see. There should be a difference between 6 months to a year worth of investment time-wise and thousands of dollars of investment in real-world currency should make a player substantially and regularly stronger than players that don't have that same time and real-world currency in place. And Vince has talked about the fact that the RNG aspect of tournaments is a function of it being in-game. I guess the biggest issue is in-game is arriving a little too quickly. We're at a point now where too many players have reached the end of progression. And so there has to be some really careful focus in finding ways to allow in-game players to have that sense of progression. And I think if we build that back into the game, I think a lot of issues with the currency valuation sort of comes out with the wash. As long as we're able to spend our coins and our gems and our stones in a way that makes our towers noticeably more powerful, we're going to feel better about even relative devaluation of those currencies. All right, so one of the segments that I got some positive feedback in on the first episode was sort of the looking at the wish list on Discord at both some of the highly voted and lower voted suggestions. So I've gone through and pulled out some that had relatively high down votes and some relatively high up votes, and I thought we'd sort of talk about them a little bit. So we're going to begin with suggestion 3061. Retroactive VIP system based on total purchases. It doesn't have to have any actual benefits, maybe just some sort of cosmetic unlocks at various levels. So this gets into that idea, I think, that we've been talking about a theme throughout the first 2 episodes of providing some sort of sense of reward for being a supporter of the game, both in terms of real world purchases and time investment. And this is going to be put at odds against players that are new to the game who don't want to be locked out of systems purely because they didn't hear about the game until a few months ago. So I think a lot of the downvotes just comes from that. It's the Occupy Wall Street movement, 99% versus the 1%. That we don't want the rewards to those players just based on a property of that is not easily replicable by other players. But I think the idea there again is just that there needs to be meaningful progression to playing the game and spending real world currency in the game to establish players to encourage us to continue to play the game and continue to spend real world currency. If we don't have that, we're going to stop doing those things. And that's not good for anybody. Whether that's through cosmetics or some sort of VIP system, maybe. But I think at the end of the day, we can achieve a lot of this, again, by that focus on in-game progression. So suggestion 3064 is a short one, BH third hole perk. So this got a lot of up votes. So I guess this is looking specifically for a perk to introduce the third black hole. That's interesting. I think the biggest issue to face there is its effect on the economy. This whole episode is about the economy and how quickly things come out of control when you increase source relative to sinks. I think there needs to be a bit of a moratorium on features implemented in the game that dramatically increase the source of currencies until we find a better balance point for the sinks. But, I can see why that's a popular suggestion. There isn't really a good perk for BH right now. A lot of ultimate weapons have them. And I don't think it's inherently a bad idea. I guess my primary fear is adding more source currency without sort of rectifying the sink situation. Right after that one, 3065 got quite a bit of downvotes, asking for temporary skins for 500 gems that would last 30 days and allow people who missed an event to temporarily have these skins. I think the sense of exclusivity and uniqueness is extremely important to players. We see that in almost every single game, and it's why cosmetics, while providing no meaningful advancement or progression in most games, are still sought after. And some of the rarest things in games that are some of the most inherently valuable to players are merely cosmetic, if they provide a sense of uniqueness or separation from other players. And any ability to sort of recreate that, after the fact, removes that sense of uniqueness. And I think the cosmetics provide a sort of a fun way of giving that to players without having a power effect. Many games have embraced it. And anytime games that have unique or rare cosmetics make those more widely available, even in sort of formats where they repaint them, change their colors or other things, it creates a lot of issues in the game. And I think that's where the downvotes are coming from. Suggestion 3066. Give us a super low graphics mode to push waves when the game becomes too laggy. Basically talking about device performance. This has a lot of upvotes, and this relates strongly to a lot of the discussion we had in the first episode about where the speed factor in tournaments and even in farms became the sort of go-to way in which FUDs attempted to add some danger to the game. But that is linked to device performance and is really kind of a unpleasant or nasty perceptual way to play. Like, it just feels bad to play. And I think trying to find low graphics ways of doing that, there's some advantages to that with particularly older devices or maybe emulators, especially if you don't care about the graphics. It can improve battery time. Nothing that I'm like inherently opposed to and maybe worth it, but I think the better idea is to address the underlying cause rather than just sort of providing these duct tape solutions. This is similar to the response of, well, just go to 1x speed. That's not really a solution. That's a band-aid. That's a mishmash of duct tape and super glue that can sort of get us across the finish line. But I think we have to address the underlying problem, which is tying these game mechanics in such a way that device performance has such a big effect, and changing. We just need to move away from speed. Speed can't be used as the defining source of danger for the game. We have to move to something different. Suggestion 3067. Allow access to tournament tiers between tournaments. This would be useful for practicing different setups. Yeah, this is something that I have wanted for a long time. One of the issues with sort of exploring tournaments and what works in tournaments is that we have such a very limited amount of time to do it. Most of us can only run one single tournament run in the game, and so we tend to stick with what we kind of think works, and any playing around with strategizing is minimal at best. And I think having the ability, even if we didn't get anything for it, like even if we didn't get coins or whatever for those runs, just having a sandbox in which we could explore different strategies for those T+ tournaments, if it's going to be something that's used, I don't know. I like that idea, and it's something that I've wanted for a while. Suggestion 3072. What if tournaments paid medals and events paid stones? This way, progress is linked mostly to your own efforts within the game. Yeah, so this is interesting. Got a lot of downvotes. But what's sort of funny is like, well, if we got stones, that's our own progress, whereas tournaments could give us medals. That's linked to the cosmetics. Well, what's interesting is you reach a certain point in the game, like where I and some other players are at, medals for the events are the limiting factor right now in advancement. Stones can't do a whole lot for me, and I'd much rather have those medals to pump amp bot and then stun bot to allow for the glass cannon build to progress. A glass cannon build gets potentially a substantial boost from those bots compared to any other build, and the glass cannon build with the fully maxed out UW is kind of the in-game meta at the moment, so that would actually do the opposite of what the poster is asking. But of course, like early game stones are worth a lot more than badges. So I don't know. That's not going to happen because I think the badges were introduced as a currency to allow FUDs to have tight control over that particular source of advancement, which is why he didn't use existing currencies. And so I don't think that's likely to go anywhere. Suggestion 3084. Block anyone with max game speed from playing in copper tournaments and automatically promote them to silver. This got proportionally a lot of downvotes. Yeah, I mean this is the idea of stomping noobs. twinking a tower and dropping it into lower tournaments purely for just the psychological harm of wasting your opponents. This is the Schadenfreude, sort of the old idea of it's not enough to win, others must lose. As somebody who has played that way in other games, I get where that comes from. It's kind of a nasty approach, and I can see why new players, that's not a pleasant experience. Linking that to game speed is a little rough, because I think it's possible to max game speed in a way where you should maybe still be competing in copper. I don't know. I mean, copper tournament is already excluded by people who have reached, I don't know, at what point can you not drop? Is it once you've been into platinum, you can't drop to copper? So a lot of your real in-game players are already removed from copper. I just think tying it to a specific skill is rife for abuse or false positives, and probably isn't a good idea. And if we need further separation of newbies, I think there's better ways to go about that. Sky 3090 got another round of downvotes where he asked to lock wave skip. Why did you guys downvote that? What you guys want your damn micro? Oh, it's okay. I get it. I mean, microing is a way rewarding active play, right? And in almost any idle games, there is some reward for active play, and microing is one of the best rewards for active play. I get it. I hate it though. I hate microing wave skip. I mean, I don't do it. I just don't do it. Except if I get in some sort of prisoner dilemma with another high-end player where I've decided for some reason that I absolutely have to win the tournament. It rarely happens these days because, again, stones don't have the same value that they used to, as we've been talking about. I'd much rather just sleep than micro. But yeah, those downvotes suggest that y'all still love your micro. That's fascinating. So for the last segment of the podcast, episode 2, I wanted to just take a slight detour along a rumor mill that has been circling along the Discord, that FUDS has realized the issue that speed has on our games and our gaming experience, and is hopefully looking at alternatives. You have to remember why speed was increased. The idea is to make things other than bosses dangerous to us, and to make that sense of danger increase the further we get into the game. You have to have that, or else there's no point in having anything but bosses. Speed has been a way to sort of do that. I guess it has done that, but it has been implemented in a way that I think has created a negative gaming experience for players and harmed the sense of progression. So I'm hoping that we're looking for a solution. And one solution that has been bandied about is to substantially slow down mobs, maybe even bring them back to early speed levels, but instead change the way they interact with our tower through mass, make them weigh a lot more. This substantially reduces the effect of our knockback, with the idea being that we can't easily push mobs back behind our blender, where we have our orb blender or frogger spinning around. And if mobs get through that, we easily push them right back into the orbs, or they have to cross again. But if they had a bigger mass, two things happen. One, we requires more shots to push them back, or we're unable to push them back. And two, those mobs that are in that space now distract from our multi-shot. The more mobs we have within tower range, we are capped at the number of things that we can fire at. Right? And so we cap out our multi-shot, allowing things to sneak through and give us. But if they're moving at slower rates, it increases the value of stuns, like the ILM stuns or stun bot, in keeping those things from hitting us, while we kind of try to push back more slowly the higher mass mobs. This adds a lot more value to ILM and StunBot, increases the sinks in the game that can help balance the economy, but still, produces a inherent danger that can increase with time. The idea is that there would still be progression elements, investment into stuns from Poison Swamp, stuns from StunBot, stuns from ILM, can all produce situations that give us time to sort of push those mobs out and then focus our multi-shot on things that are in range. I think it is not nearly device dependent, nor would it require a decrease in game speed. So I think it's an interesting solution. Trying to think about what that world might look like in terms of, again, I think it puts tremendous value in stuns, particularly stuns that work within your tower range. Right now, things like ILM and StunBot don't have nearly the value as stuns outside of tower range. So I think that would be interesting and provide, new avenues for sinks. And if you added more workshop or lab level modifications that would allow you to have a stronger pushback or interact with mass differently, that could be interesting, especially if the mass increases sort of exponentially with wave count. The lab investment and workshop investment into things to counteract that increase in mass aren't terribly useful to players that aren't reaching those levels of waves yet. So that gives in-game players something to invest in that increases their progression, but it is not something that newer players have to worry about putting their investment in, because it doesn't provide them return on that investment until they can reach those stages. So it gives you an area to put some big sinks that do provide meaningful progression without putting newer players in a position where they feel that their advancement is being capped by something that they're not able to invest in yet. Things to think about are things like mob cap. Like if we've just got a whole bunch of mobs that we can't push into our blender, we can't kill them. Reaching that sort of cap can be problematic. It can gimp our economic returns as we're not generating new mobs, or produce strange in-game mechanics as it struggles with the amount of mobs that are available. I think that does put more value on GC builds, which give us the ability to kill these mobs with something other than Blender, so that we're not relying solely on our ability to knock back into the orbs to kill things off. And I do think it can create a real sense of progressive danger for things other than bosses as we move, that hopefully is not tied to device speed or in-game speed. So I really like the idea of mass as a distinguishing characteristic over speed in terms of progression. And I think it does really offer an opportunity to differentiate sinks for in-game players that don't adversely affect new game players, and allows you to play with new mechanics more easily. Like if mass and gravity is this mechanic, you can do things like introduce an ultimate weapon that modifies gravity, so like an anti-gravity type ultimate weapon, and a lot of areas that you can play with that can actually be effective. Whereas with speed, right, you can introduce slows. We already have a ton of slows, but the problem is that for those things, speed just doesn't play well with the game. Right? So we're dealing with the act that fast mobs just produce really chaotic effects in the game. And, we don't want to have to go down to one-time speed. We don't want to have device processing power being the primary determinant of progression. And I think speed really pushes that, where my hope would be that mass can provide something similar to what speed does, but it's not tied to device performance as much, right? Allowing us to maintain our game speed, and our device processing power maybe isn't quite as important, right? We're not having things happen at rates that the frame rate can't keep up with. So I think it's an interesting balance, and I think it's a direction that I would be excited to see implemented correctly. And I hope it's something that's being looked at. It's certainly, the rumor mill certainly exists out there. That is something that's being considered. The two biggest rumors about what we might be seeing in 018 is a change to mass over speed, and of course the long touted changes to range, trying to remove range as a toxic upgrade, which means changing the way range mobs fire at us, and hopefully changing the way range works for things like bots or orbs in general, so that we don't suddenly lose the effectiveness of our bots because their absolute range around our tower is so small compared to the range that we have to operate at. I'm hoping all of that is being carefully balanced. But yeah, those are the two sort of biggest rumors hanging around right now, that we're looking at changes in range and hopefully changes in speed, all of which makes 018 patch to look forward to. And I think it's right around the corner. Right there, we just got a new small patch issued a day or so ago, I think yesterday or today, for the game, which was suggested might be the sort of last major QOL patch of 017, and that 018 is up next. I, of course, have no inside knowledge on that. I'm only basing that on what I've read on Discord. But I have a feeling that outside of small changes or improvements or bug fixing to the latest round of patches, we've probably seen the last sort of major changes for 017. There's things like the gem confirmation screen and other things I might see some tweaks. So I'm not promising that the next patch is absolutely going to be 018. I think we'll see some minor tweaks, but I would not expect any major further changes on the 017. And I think we should be expecting 018 sooner rather than later. And I will be here to discuss this with all of you after that patch drops. I want to thank everybody who has watched our prior episode and have provided me feedback. Feedback is always welcome. You're welcome to DM me on Discord or drop me an email or contact me in any way you would like. If you are enjoying the content, I would ask that you guys go ahead and like and subscribe so I can have an idea of the audience and what we're dealing with. And I will take any feedback you have and apply it to the show as best I can as I'm sort of learning my way around this. This show has been released a little later than I anticipated. I've had some complexities with my schedule and also some issues with an earlier recording of the podcast. So there's still a lot of kinks that I'm working out, but I appreciate everybody sticking with me, and I look forward to your feedback, and I look forward to our next episode, which I'm hoping might be a discussion of 018. All right, guys, take care, and I'll see you next time.